Well, good morning, everybody. It's 9 o'clock. Welcome to the Green Dialogue. And every other week or so, we like to have a guest speaker. And today we have Emily Conway, who came highly recommended from a prior speaker. Ronnie Miller, who talked about her work with bees. And she mentioned that Emily has done some cool things. I don't have a lot to say about Emily. I hope you'll add to this intro, but I did notice that she's from the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior. I don't know if that's a department or a program, which includes 12 departments and 5 colleges on campus, which sounds like a really interesting and unique program. She's a grad student in biology and ecology, and thanks so much for joining us to talk about your work, Emily.
Thanks. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, so my home department is actually plant biology, but I'm also affiliated with the Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior program. Like you said, it's a big cross-departmental group of ecologists who study lots of different things, also people who study more evolutionary biology, and then a few behavior people. There's actually a large focus on hyena behavior. I'm not sure if you've seen any of that research, but um, so yeah, it's really cool. Really nice to be able to hear a lot of diverse perspectives and sort of get both the plant focus, but also the ecology focus. Prior to MSU, I did my undergrad at Rutgers University in New Jersey, where I also studied ecology, evolution, natural resources. And that's sort of where I got started in research. I really enjoyed it. I was in a field ecology lab, so I was doing a lot of field-based, on the ground, ecological research, but in urban areas. So it was an urban restoration ecology lab, and I just sort of fell in love with urban ecology, and I love the wide open spaces and the more rural aspects of a lot of ecological field work, but just something about doing it in cities and towns where people live and being able to connect with people and sort of share what I'm doing as I'm doing it just really appealed to me. So I sort of kept that focus in my graduate work. A lot of my field studies are based in urban areas. So when I first started, it was just before COVID. So sort of interrupted my first year of graduate school. But luckily, I was still able to get out and do some field work. I did some studies in existing urban prairie restorations across southern Michigan. So I was sort of centered around Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, and Ann Arbor. There's just sort of a lot more urban restoration efforts happening in those areas. And then these past couple of years, I've been doing this sort of ongoing field study and actually in people's yards right around the Lansing area. I put a small prairie plot and I've been monitoring them. So with the idea that if we do the restoration the same everywhere, but we vary where we do it, maybe that can give us some insights into what factors might be driving the emergence of certain target plants as opposed to others. Um, and then I've also done some work in Detroit looking at some park restoration. That's quite a large collaborative group that's really interested in a lot of questions related to sort of turning abandoned parks, essentially like turf grass fields, back into more natural plant communities and what effect that might have for the plants themselves, birds, and sort of the natural environment, but also human health. Like how might the different soundscape change? How might having access to that green space improve cardiovascular health? Things like that. So that's some really cool work happening in Detroit. And then I guess sort of my last research component has been looking at something that's like really unique to urban areas, and that's road salt deposition. So us in Michigan and a lot of northern states dump a lot of salt on the road. And that can have really big impacts on the surrounding waterways, but also the surrounding soil. So how does that impact maybe our goals of reestablishing greenways along roads? So I do some of that work out at the Kellogg Biological Station, looking at road salt deposition on sort of those very early stages of plant establishment. So in a nutshell, those are all my various projects, which I'm hoping to wrap up this year. But I'm happy to take any questions about those things, or I have some pictures from my work if you want to see those.
Well, I'm not sure people are ready for questions right so soon, but this is a rare treat. So if you do have something, um, one that comes to mind for me is been doing some work in the roundabout at Park Lake and Bircham, which is an area of high salt.
Yeah.
And we've been trying to establish kind of a garden there with native plants. And that's been a challenge. And a couple weeks ago, we did talk about maybe doing a project, sort of a restoration of the restoration, looking at working with Carolyn Miller, possibly the Meridian Garden Clubs. Anyway, you mentioned the road salt and restoration. That's a project locally that maybe could use some of your input.
Oh yeah, it's very cool. So the project, I can speak a little bit more about that. So I have a big field site with a bunch of plots, and I've been testing different salt levels. So from 0 up to sort of what I think is maybe a high road salt level. But I also have the seed source component to it, where I was thinking maybe if we source seeds from areas that experience just naturally high salt deposition or have experienced historically high salt deposition, like from coastal communities, perhaps they may have some sort of tolerance or ability to deal with salt than populations that historically have not experienced this road salt deposition. So I was able to source some seeds for a subset of species that I included in that study from coastal New Jersey. And turns out, no, seed sourcing in this way doesn't seem to make a huge difference, except for a couple species. So Monarda fistulosa and Verbena stricta, so like bee balm and hoary vervain, they seem to have some benefit from the seed sourcing component. But yeah, overall salt is just really bad.
I'll just see some pictures of your urban prairie restorations if you have any that you'd like to share. But anybody else have any questions immediately? Feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand. Sam?
Well, Emily, you just kind of caught my ear there when you said you're doing some work in Detroit. So as you go along, I'd really be interested in hearing more about that and maybe some of the partners you're working with and the areas where you're working. But I mean, if you want to just include that in your with your pictures, that's fine. However you want to present that.
Sure. Yeah, I'll have to, it might take me a minute to pull up some pictures from Detroit. But so that's a big collaboration between some researchers at MSU, like several other research institutions. So it was started by people who are mostly interested in the human health component. So there's a lot of researchers that are looking at that. And then sort of the more natural science researchers, there's one of the project leaders is based in Carleton University in Ontario. And they're particularly looking at the bird species that are in the surrounding community and how that might shift as we, like how the neighborhood bird community might shift as we put a more natural area in that neighborhood. I'm the plant person, so me and my advisor go out and survey the plants each year. And then there's also the Detroit Audubon Society. They do so they sort of partner with the park maintenance component, and they also do some bird surveys and point counts as well. And then US Fish and Wildlife actually partnered to provide the seed for the initial restoration. And I think they might be doing some bee surveys, although with the pandemic and people's lives changing, some of that has not been as consistent. So those are, and then also the city of Detroit, who is leasing the parks. Essentially, it's like a long-term lease, is involved somewhat.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Fish and Wildlife Service in the shoal restoration. Is that a particular, is that Sugar Island possibly, or do you know what?
Oh, I'm not sure. So these parks are based in all across like the downtown part of Detroit. So like neighborhoods within those areas. Yeah. they don't look like parks, I'll be honest. They look like maybe a vacant lot, but they're technically designated parkland by the city.
Cool. Well, I I think you and I could probably have a long conversation about this, but maybe we could do that, offline too. So, but what you're talking about is very interesting to me. So let's make sure we connect on that.
Sure, yeah. I can put my email in the chat. Feel free to send me an email, anybody with questions. Okay, let me pull up some pictures. Oh, sure.
Peter had a question.
Yeah, I don't know to what extent you've investigated, the old family Chenopodiaceae, which the lamb's quarters family, which is now a part of the amaranth family, according to APG4, has a large number of halophytes in its ranks. And I live pretty close to M78 by Hazlitt, Michigan here. And as I understand it, we have communities based on the genus Sueda, which appear to be wildly salt tolerant. And I just wondered if it had ever been experimented with as a way to get an inroad into a high saline area.
That is really interesting. I don't know. So some of this work is looking at salt tolerance and sort of roadside restoration is pretty recent in the academic literature. There's not a lot out there. A lot has sort of been focused on how it impacts water and sort of aquatic systems. There's some work on trees and how, especially like salt splash onto trees, can impact it. There hasn't been a lot of work. I know that there's some work, I think actually in maybe Philadelphia, looking at their rain gardens and trying to sort of develop better or rain gardens that are more resilient to the salt stress because they're capturing all of that from the roads. But that's very interesting. I know just like offhand observationally in Detroit, we see a lot of lamb's quarters, a lot of amaranth species, and I don't know if there's any connection between that road maintenance and sort of the abundance of those maybe more weedy non-target species in the restoration. So we definitely do see more of those, I think, in Detroit than I do see in some of my other work.
Interesting.
I will
Thanks.
say, yeah, I've seen like seaside goldenrod growing out of road cracks and stuff. So definitely some of those more salt tolerant, salt adapted species do make their way into urban areas.
I recently read that East Lansing, I believe, has switched from salts to a brine, and they actually brine the roads prior to the storm rather than after the fact with salting. And supposedly it's like 20% of the salt load that regular salting does. Is anyone doing a before or after kind of work on that?
Again, that's a really great question. I know when I was starting this project, it was really challenging to find even like rates of salting. So municipal groups will maybe set some guidelines, but they subcontract out a lot. And there's really very little regulation about how much salt people are dumping on the roads. And people aren't really keeping track of it. I know that they're, especially in areas that are more, I think there was a study in Canada looking at some towns that are along some of the Great Lakes and things, looking at different salt application methods, again, looking at runoff and different salt types. But yeah, it's a very new field and it's a little bit hard to keep track of since nobody's super regulating it.
We did have a national expert a couple of years ago, Danelle Hakey, who talked a little bit about brine and some of the research that's been going on. Might be fun to have her back sometime. But you can view her presentation. I'll post the playlist for some of these prior green dialogues in the chat window. We have talked a lot about urban restoration and planting native plants, a lot of interest in restoring wetlands, protecting wetlands. So some of your research, I'm sure, would appeal to a lot of folks, as well as lessons learned from prairie restoration.
Yes, yeah. I'll pull up some pictures of the plots I have in people's yards. Okay. So here what I'm showing you is a map of where I have, oops, my prairie plantings. So, oops. Most of them, so the colors here, more pink and red, indicates more urban land cover. So I have some that are really super urban, and then I tried to get some that were a little bit less just to have a good comparison. And I sort of initiated these prairie plantings in a very cost-effective way, which is sort of by smothering the plot for a whole year with several layers of cardboard. The fancy name is sheet mulching. And I have about, well, when I started, it was closer to 40 sites, but a few people have moved away and things like that. So now we're down to 35. But the sites were prepared for a summer and then basically a fall using the sheet mulching method. And as you can see, did a really good job. It was pretty much bare ground under there once I went to apply the seed. I applied the seed in December. So once the ground was cold enough that seeds wouldn't germinate. And there's some different strategies for putting seed out. Some will do a spring application, some will do a winter application. The benefit of doing this in the winter is you allow the seeds to cold stratify naturally. So we applied in the winter. And then I went back and surveyed. This is a small picture. I'll show you some bigger pictures of yards and things. So some plots look really great, and there's tons of the seeded species like Rudbeckia or Black-eyed Susan. And sometimes they just looked pretty crappy. They smelled down at the bottom. Very little emergence, a lot of bare ground. So it's been very interesting to see. I was pretty nervous. I thought they all might look like this bare ground one in the corner, but luckily most of them are looking pretty good. We can see like some of the echinaceas blooming. Definitely a lot of Rudbeckia, Herta, Black-eyed Susan. That is one of the best early establishing species for sure. But we see some bee balm, we see some of that quarry vervain, even some of the prairie grasses that I seeded in. I've been seeing like prairie drop seed and little blue stem. In these prairie plantings, I sort of stayed away from some of those classic big prairie grasses like big blue stem or Indian grass, just because they can get so tall and so dense, and they have a tendency to sort of take over. And these plots are relatively small. They're about 3 meters by 3 meters. So I sort of stayed away from anything that's really tall, really dense, really floppy, and sort of pick some of the shorter stature prairie plants that are commonly seeded into restorations. So this is sort of a modification of a low diversity seed mix that was provided by Native Connections, which is a local seed producer in Kalamazoo.
Interesting. Did you do any soil testing or sort of site evaluation or soil amendment, or is it more just the killing off the grass and then planting?
In terms of site preparation, no, it's just killing everything. We sort of lightly raked before we put the seed down just to sort of improve that seed to soil contact, but I was really hesitant to sort of disturb the soil in any way. I didn't really want to stir up any of the weed seeds that might be in the soil seed bank. And given the short sort of time span of a graduate degree, sort of was like, we don't really have the time to like fully exhaust that seed bank. So better to just not disturb it. And I think that it worked out pretty well. I did do some soil testing afterwards just to sort of understand the soil environment that the seeds are growing in and sort of compare how it might be different across the sites. And then I also did some measurements of like how much urban land was surrounding each of these sites as a sort of a proxy for like how urban or urbanization around each of these sites. And then I also did some measurements of sort of the canopy, so as a proxy for the light environment that the seeds might be experiencing, as well as collecting some sort of just basic climate data, so temperature and precipitation across the experiment.
Apologies, but how did you recruit people to participate? It looks like you've got quite a few. I mean, 35 little native plots is pretty impressive.
Yeah, so it started with just like a email to like every email listserv I had access to, basically. And then it started, people were forwarding it on. I had about 60 people that I initially visited their houses just to do a quick evaluation to see if it would be a good fit. And then I sort of cut it down to about 40. So I was sort of overwhelmed with the amount of interest, to be honest with you. I was really shocked how many people wanted basically to just give up a chunk of their lawn to a project that like may or may not work. I was really surprised. So a few people I had to turn away just because it was like full shade in their yards or things like that. But for the most part, people were like more than willing to sign up. So if you're interested in doing something like this, people seem really motivated, especially since it's pretty low maintenance. So I really wanted to try and keep everything the same across plots as much as I could. So basically no maintenance has gone into these plots. I had the homeowners mow each plot after the first growing season. After I did my plant surveys, just mowed it once. And that was mostly to stop any of those weedy sort of priority species from going to seed. And then after the second growing season, I just had them go in and cut some of the more pernicious weeds that had maintained. So like the Verbascum thapsus, I just had them cut as opposed to mowing the whole plot, because for most of the plots, there was really good establishment of some of the prairie species that we had seeded, and there was a lot of stuff flowering. So people were a little reluctant to mow it all down that second growing season. But very little maintenance has gone into these plots, so I didn't have them water. I didn't really have them weed or do any herbicide. It's just that one mowing and then a more targeted weeding the second year.
Wow, really interesting. Anybody have any questions related or not related? You've covered a lot of ground, no pun intended here. What are some of the lessons learned from your from your research in the urban prairie or other that you might, if you had another 3 years of grad school, what would you focus on next?
Yeah, what's really interesting about restoration is we're really bad at it. We're really bad at doing things very predictably and really successfully, like restoration after restoration. So a lot of my work has been trying to figure out why, like what might be causing so much variation or such poor establishment. Like why aren't we consistently reaching our restoration goals? And there's been a lot of work in former agricultural lands or in places like post logging or post mining, but a lot of work hasn't really been done on this work in urban areas. Urban ecology is a really young field, like really got its start in the 90s or so. So there's been a lot of really great work looking at like what is in urban areas, what kind of biodiversity are we observing and what might that be related to? Like, is it something about the soils or land use legacies, or is it something about people moving plants in and out or moving species in and out? Or is it maybe tied to like wealth and gardening and things like that? So there's been a lot of work just sort of characterizing urban spaces, but this urban restoration is really new. And, we would think that certain things would carry over, like it must be something about the soils and it must be something about the temperature and precipitation that's important. But all those things are so different in urban areas. So like temperature is modified because cities are typically hotter with all that impervious surface, all that concrete, all the pavement absorbing heat. So we see very different temperature regimes in cities than we do outside of cities. And soils are super modified because we do a lot of construction and we remove topsoil and we put in fill material and we build buildings and then we collapse them into themselves and put dirt over, So all of the things that we would expect to, maybe challenge a plant community from being restored are so different in urban areas. And I think some of the consistent themes are soils tend to be quite important and quite modified in urban areas, especially when we're thinking about compaction, water holding capacity, organic matter, and some of those like heavy metals that we might see from just like sort of pollution deposition or previous industrial uses of the land seem to be important. And then also that sort of bioclimate. So the temperature, the precipitation is particularly important in that first year when you're planting a restoration. But things like this proxy I developed for how urban the land is doesn't seem to be that important for restoration. And I think that is likely because we're bringing in the plants that we want. We're not relying on them to get there by themselves. Sure, Kim.
Kim?
Right. Yeah, I apologize for coming in late. You sort of touched on one of the things with urban areas or maybe industrial areas with the metals and things in the ground. And I read an article last week about the fact that sunflowers, I think the word was, are phytoremediators, that they're actually able to pull heavy metals from the soil or stabilize them in the ground or something like that. Is that something that you know about, how that works?
I don't know a lot about it, but I know that there are some of the things that we would consider a heavy metal, like iron, are also a plant micronutrient. So some species maybe need higher levels of that, require higher levels of that to grow. So I think that there are some species that are naturally better at pulling some of those minerals or heavy metals that could be considered plant micronutrients as well out of the soil. I know there's been some work in New York looking at trees and how trees might help remediate the soil, but I don't know a lot about it.
Thank you.
Kim, based on what I've seen in Detroit, there has been quite a bit of better remediation done by Michigan State University. In fact, years ago, particularly on the Rouge River in and around the Rouge plant, the Ford Motor Company's Rouge factory, and a lot of the plants that were used were poplar trees. Those fast-growing poplars that can extract the chemicals out of the soil. Apparently, that species is really pretty good at it, and I don't know. I wish I knew more about it, but I think the idea then is to harvest the trees, and I'm not sure where they go from there because they could have some toxins in them. But it apparently does work. It takes some time to do that, but it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I was thinking of it in terms of the old GM plants that were torn down over on West Saginaw, and then over off of Rosemary. I know that Adams Plating is still, I believe, a Superfund site. Things like that. If planting different varieties of plants and trees, if that might help pull some of that crap out of the soil.
Yeah, I think it does, and there's been a lot of research on it. It's out there. Some of the answers are out there for sure. Clayton Rue is the guy that I can remember his name. He was a Michigan State guy that did a lot of that work back in the previous century, not too long ago. But I think he's with a private organization now somewhere in one of the southern states, doing that kind of work. So it's out there. There's definitely some information if you dig for it.
Thank you.
It seems like in the last 30, 40 years, there has been a growth of alternative landscapes in urban areas. And given the conversations we've had here, it seems like there's a lot of interest. Did you notice in your neighborhoods that you worked in, in following years, did you see other plots pop up, or did you get a lot of interest from neighbors, or did the people that you worked with have interest in their neighborhoods and see more of this sprouting?
Yeah, people are definitely interested. I did have several neighbors approach me if I was going to do maybe a second year of establishing the plots, and I would have loved to, but I'm just one person, so wasn't really in my capacity to sort of expand this project. But I think that there's a ton of interest in neighborhoods for especially some of the flowering native species like those bee balms and the black-eyed Susans and the echinacеas. Like a lot of interest in attracting pollinators and butterflies and bird species, as well as having those sort of more charismatic plant species in their yards for sure. I was seeing a lot more interest as I went along. And I did see some native plantings in other people's yards, and some people that I worked with already had some native plantings elsewhere on their property and were sort of looking to expand. And even the homeowners that I currently work with, especially the ones whose plots are looking really nice, are sort of looking to sort of build on the plot that's already there and expand it. So there's definitely a lot of interest. I was really surprised. I thought people maybe were more tied to their lawns, but it seems like people are interested in sort of diversifying their landscape. It's appealing, right? You don't have to mow a prairie. You have to mow a lawn. It's a lot less maintenance in some ways.
Common theme that has come up is start small. And that seems like how you've done it. I mean, actually 3 yards by 3 yards is maybe bigger than what some people should do, but a little fact sheet on how you did it or how to do it might be an interesting one to share with residents that want to start. Ryan, by the way, is our poster child for using cardboard on his landscape. He's personally recycled about 30 cubic yards of cardboard here at the township.
Yeah, I was a frequent flyer at the MSU Recycling Center. People started to recognize me. Just put their recycling in my car instead of in the dumpster. It's very effective. I just used recycled cardboard and then those landscaping staples that are, about 6 inches long, and you just sort of overlap things and staple it down. And it was pretty effective. I mean, they looked a little scraggly by the end, but for the most part, there wasn't a lot of like sort of cardboard blowing away or anything like that. So it was pretty effective for sure. I'm happy to share. So actually a former postdoc in my research lab has a website. It's called Lawns to Wildflowers, and sort of use that as a guide. It's really great.
Did you do anything to the cardboard, like remove the tape or any particular types of cardboard you stayed away from?
Yeah, I usually remove the tape. I tried to stay away from ones that were like printed on, sometimes you can get a cardboard box that's like all has like some sort of coloring on it. Just sort of tried to stick with the like brown corrugated cardboard and removed as much tape as I could. I'll be honest, there's a lot of cardboard and I wasn't always removing all of the tape that was there. But yeah, pretty simple for sure. It's usually about 2 or 3 layers and sort of just tack it all down. I did dampen it afterwards, but I don't know if that's like super necessary, but it did sort of help all the layers of cardboard sort of melt together.
Eventually it was removed and probably had to landfill it at that point or compost.
Yeah, most of it ended up in sort of just dumpsters at MSU campus. It was I was trying to seed all in like the same day or 2 days, just to try and keep everything as consistent as possible. So the volume of cardboard at the end was huge, doing it all at once. And it ended up, yeah, just in dumpsters, unfortunately. I wish I could have composted it, but there just like wasn't a venue to handle that much cardboard at one time.
Any other questions? We don't have to stay on this topic the whole hour if people have other things they would like to talk about. But what other questions do you have for Emily? Emily, thank you so much for joining us. If you have other researchers, or if you want to share that link to that guide, that would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your email. Anybody else have any comments or topics of interest that they would like to bring up? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, more a comment than anything else. But last summer when it was so dry, I don't ever water my lawn. I'm not a big fan of large swaths of grass, and I hate mowing. So I kind of, until it gets about, until the weeds are, 6, 8 inches tall, then I don't even bother with it. But, and I'm not quite sure how it happened last summer, but I ended up with a patch about 4 feet by 2 feet, maybe, roughly, of a bunch of coreopsis that self-seeded. And I suddenly had, all these yellow flowers in the middle of my lawn. And I thought, wow, I'm not quite sure how that happened, but it sure is pretty. So now that area is I plan this summer to make it bigger and possibly add some, different types of flowers and things in there. And so I'm going to have an island of flowers in my yard. That was it.
No, that's very cool. So Coreopsis, it does really well. I've noticed in a lot of the prairie plots. So does black-eyed Susan, some of those vervains, if you see them. I know like Van Atta has a lot of native plants that you can buy that they've already started for you. But also from seed, a lot of the prairie species do quite well. That's like a very common method for establishing those prairie species. And I have gone to Native Connections. They're based in Kalamazoo. I think that they're really awesome. But there's a lot of native seed producers in Michigan that you can get seed from. There's even some actually in Detroit. There's some native seed producing farms that have been established in Detroit, which is pretty cool.
I also, the AM Conservation District has trees and shrubs for sale, but I now get emails from Eaton Conservation District as well, and they have some prairie seed varieties available from them as well.
I noticed, not to totally change the subject, but I noticed you worked for a memorial forest. I wondered if there's been some conversations about green burial, and I don't know if that memorial forest has any connection with green burial, but is that something that you've run into, that topic, or what was your work in the memorial forest?
Yeah, so my undergrad, I was an intern at Hutchison Memorial Forest, which is actually a Rutgers owned research property. So it's part old growth forest and part sort of experimental property. So there's some old fields that they keep as well in different successional stages to study sort of succession from sort of land abandonment or maybe former agricultural lands on. And there's actually one of the longest running succession studies there, the Beal, no, I forget. It's been a few years. But it's quite a small property. I think that the old growth forest is only about 90 acres, and it was actually gifted to Rutgers in like the 1950s, I think, with the one stipulation that there can be no management within the forest, just sort of experimentation in the forest and surrounding it, which is very interesting. I'm sure many of you know, saying no management is a pretty decisive management choice. So there's really high rates of invasion from sort of like woody vines and shrubs, as well as some invasive tree species that they're really struggling to manage. There's also a really high deer population pressure in that forest as well. So a lot of the work I did there was in sort of helping researchers on various different projects and doing some outreach initiatives there. But because it's like a university owned property, it's a little bit different sort of management than maybe some other sort of memorial forests or old growth forests that are well, there's very few existing, I guess, still, but especially over on the East Coast.
So no connection to green burial in that
I don't
memorial.
think so.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But that's interesting, the no management approach. That's an issue here in Meridian Township, is how do we manage these land preserves, and no management seems appealing to, but I can understand the folks who are working on invasive species don't agree with me.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I know in Michigan, sort of the deer population's about 10 to 15 maybe per square mile. Is that right?
Sure.
Not sure. But in the East Coast, especially in sort of the New Jersey, New York area, it could be up to like 100 deer per square mile. So the deer pressure is just insane. And they preferentially go after those native species, right? So it just sort of creates this like horrible feedback loop of invasion pressure and the native plant species being sort of just mowed down by the deer population. So not being able to manage those things has created sort of a conundrum.
Is that for the entire forest or just a section of the forest?
Just the old growth portion. So they've installed a deer fence, although I don't know, deer are pretty crafty, so it doesn't really keep them out. It's not sort of an impermeable barrier as they had intended. But yeah, just within that old growth portion of the forest, I think the intention was like, we want to keep it pristine, don't manage it, we don't want to change it. But you know, other things besides humans can change a forest, it can change a plant community. So I think it's sort of maybe an idealist perspective to say no management and some plant communities like that.
Anyone else have any comments or issues on their mind? Suggestions for future speakers, or questions for Emily? This has been a rare opportunity to chat with you, Emily. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem.
I never would have guessed all the things that you've been involved with.
Yeah.
If you need any more volunteers, I'm sure you could find some more for Prairie Restoration on this channel.
Yeah, I'm hoping to graduate this semester, but I'm happy to share with you the process and the species list that I use, things like that, if people are interested, for sure. I wish I could keep doing it, but.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Any other parting comments before we move on?
Leroy, I just will mention this one idea that I talked about with you briefly for a speaker, just to see what people think, if they're interested or not. But I did see an interesting presentation, I think it was last week or not too long ago, about the Detroit riverfront. Mark Wallace, who is the champion of that project from the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy, has a really, really nice presentation showing a lot of before and after pictures. Maybe some of you know that the Detroit Riverfront has been named the best river walk in the United States for the last 3 years by by USA Today. So it's kind of getting some really good recognition. But and it's a greenway too, you know, it's all tied in with the regional greenways in and around Detroit. So it has some I think some basic fundamental concepts that would apply to Meridian Township, but keeping in mind it's highly urban and obviously on a big river, which is not anything like the Red Cedar River. Detroit River is, you know, it's basically just a channel between the two Great Lakes. But if it's interesting to you guys, you know, I'd be glad to invite him. There's no guarantee we'll get him. He did at the end of his presentation kind of offer up that he would do this for other groups, but you know, he's a really busy guy too, so there's no guarantees. But if you're interested, I can reach out to him. So just something to think about.
Folks
I'd
like to
be
hear,
interested, Sam.
What was that?
I would be interested. This is Kim.
Oh, hi, Kim. Sure. Okay, cool.
sounds like it's decided then. Go ahead, Sam. We can put him on the agenda. And
Well, again, there's no guarantees. I can shoot him an email, and it might not be real soon either, depending on his schedule. But we maybe can get him lined up.
strikes me that it might be interesting to build a little momentum. Maybe there are some other local trail related or river related issues emerging that could also kind of fit in with this conversation. I'm just thinking out loud here. But it might start the conversation too. So on that note, John Sarver, who's with us today, will be talking about Solarize, which has grown into a statewide initiative to promote solar. It's kind of like something that's been going on and facilitating growth in solar in Meridian for the last few years. He's going to chat a little bit about that in 2 weeks. So I hope you'll join us. Just recently, we scheduled our first Solarize workshop in the township, which will be April 1st. I'm not fooling you on that one, but that'll be at the town hall, and we'll have the Great Lakes Renewable Energy Association is going to be helping with registration, I believe. So you'll hear more about that in the future. And again, everyone, thanks for tuning in. Any other parting comments or comments for Sam about this potential speaker? Bruce, did you have something?
No, nope. I just was getting ready to wave.
I thought it was a sunrise for a minute. Thanks, Emily. Really glad you could join us, spend a few minutes.
Yeah,
Good
thanks for
to
having me.
Good to see everyone.
Bye-bye.
Hope to
Thank
see you
you.
next week for open dialogue.
Bye-bye.